Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Art of the News, Comics Journalism, an exhibition for the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. I'm joined here today by my co-host, Dave Sanyal.
Hey, everyone. We are incredibly grateful to have as our guest for today's interview, a Lebanese multi-hyphenate artist, editor, comics genius, and author, Omar Khouri. How are you today, Omar?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure always a pleasure to talk about comics with people. So I hope you guys are doing well.
We are. So I will just say that one of the most exciting and amazing threads running through all of the artists in the show is this ability to world, that is to create an entirely new context of possibilities and create something that really did not exist before. So I want to know first, how did you imagine a Middle East comic scene that really wasn't there before Samandal and has never been the same since?
Well, I never really, I guess when I started making comics and started thinking about starting Samandal, I never really had a vision for what Arabic comics might be like, or comics in the Middle East could go to. It was just, I just really wanted to make comics, and I thought there must be a bunch of other people who are spread around the region, in the country and the region, stuff like that, who also kind of want to explore and figure out, okay, we've all grown up on what French comics are, what Japanese manga is, and what American comics are, and all the things in between. Maybe by just experimenting together, then we'll have something that becomes what Middle Eastern comics is, what it means to be. I mean, in general, that's for like the vision of Samandal. But for my own personal work, I had some little experiments that I was doing. Be like, okay, these are things that I've learned. How do in my comics, or what do I find something that's specifically for Arabic, like how to use the language, how to use the calligraphy in a specific way, because it's a whole other part of making comics. What kind of layouts can be specifically more, local in their design and things like that. But yeah, it was just basically starting Samandal was like, okay, let's find out what this thing could be. And with these people that we started to meet, and then we also wanted to open it up for people from other countries, people with a French background, American background, Japanese people, to kind of mix those things with these new people that are all trying new things and see what comes up.
Given that your work, both in fine arts, oil painting, and in comics, how do you imagine your role as an artist between these different types of cultural production?
Well, I guess at the moment I have my view of my role and of my role as an artist, or the role of art in general, shifts quite drastically, quite often, as you say. So like at the moment, I'm a bit feeling like questioning this idea of like, can art really be can it really be a force of change in the world? Can it really be culturally significant? Is it really something that helps make the world a better place? At the moment I'm questioning these ideas again. As an artist, you just kind of go in and out of these questions continuously. So at the moment I'm like, at least if these questions aren't answered, at least I'll try my best to add as much beauty as I can into the world, like as much pleasure that I can give others in this world that seems to be falling apart for people in Lebanon drastically, but for people everywhere really, and as well. So yeah, this corner of space-time, I kind of feel like this is my role as an artist. This is the best I can offer at the moment.
Following up on that, but also picking up on what you said earlier in terms of the way that Samandal was both simultaneously quite national in that it is specific to a particular time and place in Lebanon, but also very transnational in terms of networking so many artists and readers together around the world. How do you imagine the audience for this beauty that you're bringing into the world? And who are you writing or creating art for? Or are there different readerships that you're hoping to address?
In terms of audience for comics, especially when we were starting Samandal, it was just kind of impossible to imagine who the audience might be. So if you also look at the old issues, the old magazines, they were just kind of a little bit all over the place, because we were just the same way that we were trying to find a language for comics here or make a scene, we were also looking for that audience, putting out different things, going to different schools and universities, and then trying to, you know, go to the art scene a bit and go and try to dip internationally in festivals and things like that, just to see where we can find an audience, because we had no idea who might end up reading this. So, you know, in the end, we were kind of making it like the audience mostly could be seen, especially in the beginning, like the artist actually involved. Like we were almost drawing these things for each other to get each other's feedback, because we didn't know yet who else would give us feedback. And that kind of family grew as the number of artists and collaborators grew over the years to the hundreds. You know, the kind of audience spread around them in that way, and each kind of person or group or active brought their audiences in, and kind of created this whole other this whole layer of readership that now is, I mean, it's not huge, but I think there's some people who follow and are still interested.
Speaking about like the audience also and also the kind of approach to a particular kind of comics, when did you get interested in doing non-fiction comics especially, and do you kind of approach non-fiction comics differently than your fictional work?
Yeah, when we were, I mean, I started being interested in comics journalism kind of when I read Palestine by Joe Sacco. And it was before we started Samandal or anything, but as soon as we started Samandal, when we were trying to, I'm saying, looking for an audience, trying to kind of explain to the people around us what are comics. They're not just for kids. Like the biggest challenge that we had dealing with like making Samandal was getting people to start thinking of it as an art form that is for adults. It's not just this, oh, cartoons for kids and, you know, that kind of stuff, because people can brush it off. So we were always trying to look for ways that comics could show itself as this kind of mature medium that is for adults. And so we were always interested, we started being interested in comics journalism then, just at least in research and talking to people and trying to get people to do work for Samandal and things like that. I mean, I did a couple of, they weren't journalistic, but like, let's say nonfiction comics that were editorials for the magazine, kind of like essays in comics, a la Scott McCloud, perhaps as well. But yeah, personally, for me, I wasn't very interested in journalistic comics until Andy Warner, a really good friend of ours that I met through Samandal, who is one of the editors of the Nib magazine. His work started going into journalist comics and like nonfiction comics, documentary comics, and I really love his work. It was really interesting. And then he started working for the Nib, and he suggested that some of the people like Yazan and I and a few of our other friends from Samandal that had worked with him to start contributing to the Nib, some of this in this format. And so yeah, I mean, I've never been interested in writing like a journalistic comic. And the main difference for me between fiction and nonfiction comics basically is I usually work with a writer when I'm doing nonfiction, but fiction stuff, most of the time I write it myself. So really, it started with Yazan on our first Nib comic, maybe 2017 or 18, about Syria. It was like about an update of the war in Syria, what was going on. That was my first interest into that. And yeah, the fact that I'm not writing, working from a script with somebody else changes like the whole process for me entirely. I don't know if you want me to go into details with that, but I mean, that's kind of in general.
Yeah, actually, I would love to hear more about the specific process, both that you use when collaborating from a script by Azan or someone like that, and then also how you create your own comics. So what is the distinction in terms of your method and practices?
Yeah, when I work with Yazan, it's specifically because we're really good friends and we kind of like the same kind of comics a lot, and we hang out and whatever. So we have a pretty good shorthand, if you will. So it's quite a fluid process. Like he'd have an idea, and then we discuss the idea first at the idea stage, and then get excited about it together. And then so he'd go off and write a script. He has a really fast writer. He has a really good turnaround. He just writes a lot and doesn't have this procrastination kind of feeling. So you talk about something like the next day, it's like, here it is, the script. I'm like, whoa, okay. But it's good because then we go back and forth on the script a few times before we submit it to the editor, let's say, of the Nib. We work for the Nib. And so he'd say, write the script. I'd, look at it and be like, oh, what about this idea and that idea? And plus he writes into the script, the panels sometimes, but he's like, these are suggestions. Like I have a suggestion for this and that. And he gives me complete freedom to change them if I want, but these are very useful for me to see how he's thinking. So we go back and forth on the script, and then he sends it in, we get rewrites, and then I do thumbnail sketches, run them by Yazan first. If he has a little bit kind of, some comments, fix those up, then send them into the editor. So we're always kind of like conspiring behind closed doors before we send anything out. And then it's pencils, and it comes back to you with, at that point, Yazan's role kind of starts going into the background, and it's just me going with pencils. I send in the pencils, they come back, the editor comes back with some changes or whatever, and then inks, and then colors as the last stage. And then, yeah, and there you have it, a comic is born. Yes, and also sometimes like has reference photos and videos that he's collected through his research. Like he'd be writing something in his research, and he'd have like links to websites, and he'd have videos that he's seen, or photos, images that he has in his head. Like in the Bashar Assad, like in the first comic that we did together, there's the first shot, Bashar Assad sitting on the throne from Akira, and he had like that opening image already in his mind. It's like, I want this exactly, and he sent me the image. I'm like, yeah, well, that you don't have to send me that picture, I know it by heart anyway. But and so Yazan has a very strong visual imagination, which is quite helpful for me a lot of times. It's like, this is exactly what I'm like, yes, that looks great, I'll draw it. And then sometimes he'll just completely trust me, and then I'll come up with that with the visuals my way. For my own stuff, I guess it's the funny thing is, like, it's quite extreme, the difference between the nonfiction and fiction comics, because my fiction is usually like science fiction, kind of, or like surreal, or so it's just kind of further away from reality than just regular fiction even. So it just kind of pushes those two things apart. So yeah, with those, I always have like these ideas floating around that I kind of write in my sketchbook here and there, and then sometimes one of them just sticks and starts spreading inside my head. And so yeah, a lot of times I start by like sketching a couple of things, and then I start thumbnailing while I do the script. Like the script is in kind of in thumbnail visual form for me a lot of times. There are some times when I write like a movie script almost without panel design or anything, just for dialogue and story. But usually I just kind of imagine the flow of it in my head entirely, combining visuals and text at the same time. So I start drawing and then filling in the text in the little thumbnails, and then I kind of just build it up from there. Yeah, because then when you have the whole thumbnails, you can kind of read the whole thing in a way, and of course get a lot of people. I have a lot of very smart friends, much more talented than I am, that I kind of can rely on, be like, read this, look at this, let me know what you think. And so a lot of times I'm just like revising based on other people's ideas, but I like that collaborative aspect of it. Even though I'm sitting and doing this whole thing by myself, it's still like so many ideas are coming from other people's suggestions, and like, yes, this totally makes it better. I'll take that. Thank you. And you're right, this doesn't work at all. Even though I'm attached to it, I have to like fight with that idea. I love that scene, but it doesn't work. Scrap it. So yeah, and then I just kind of build it from there. I mean, I usually don't do the whole comic in pencil and then a whole comic in ink and then all colors when my own stuff. That I just kind of almost do it spread by spread, pencil inks, and pencil inks every 2 pages. And then, well, I don't usually add color in my fiction stuff, except Utopia maybe, but yeah, that's a different story. But so that's kind of the flow of things in both cases.
Can I just add a quick follow-up? I mean, especially between your sci-fi work like Utopia and your work on, say, Syria, is there a different kind of responsibility you feel in creating the visuals or in having some sort of accuracy with what you're drawing, or is that not really a part of your process?
That's part of my process, though, in both. The accuracy, like I started out, like my first comic, it's called Salon Tariq al-Khuraf. It's the first one that I started Samandal with. It was the one I started. And it was like a science fiction thing set in Beirut. And I wanted to be very clear that it was set in Beirut. And it was in Arabic. And so I did a lot of drawings in that series that were very realistic, based on specific angles from the city, that people who know the city will be like, oh, this is obviously just Beirut. So it's trying to bring that, bring kind of sci-fi into our lives, because, we grew up on sci-fi of everywhere else. And although it's great, but there's something about it that's grounded somewhere else in different slight differences in society that it comes from and all these kind of things. And a lot of people feel like, yes, like this is sci-fi from Japan. You can totally, you can totally understand what that is, like Akira, for instance. But so I've always wanted to do that in my fiction and my science fiction comics, is just kind of put that realism there, ground it in the area. So when it came time to do journalistic comics, I already had that in my in the way that I worked, and so I didn't really have to shift a lot. It still has also in the Nib comics or the Guantanamo Voices comics that you have some panels that are very based on a very obvious what do you call it, like reference of a spot of an angle of a corner. And then there's other stuff that gets a bit cartoonier when the characters are around, and then I can get a bit more, symbolic or abstract or whatever kind of thing has to come in it. So I do both of those in both the comics, I think, equally almost. So it doesn't, I mean, to go back to your, like, let's say, phrasing of it, I don't feel like it's a responsibility. It's just kind of what makes it a good thing for me. Like, this is how I already do my stuff, so it feels like, oh yeah, this fits in my style automatically by itself. Like I don't have to struggle and fight with it, or search for it kind of specifically in that way.
Going off on that, you said that how it kind of works for you, that this is your style and you're kind of working through that style. Why do you think that comics can be specifically an effective form for non-fiction reportage in defining and identifying the kind of problems and
Well, it's kind of exactly for those reasons, because when you're doing a comic, you have more freedom to get as realistic as you want for a specific moment to make a specific point, and then you can get as subjective as you want once it's needed inside of the same piece. It has that fluidity where you can just kind of mold it the way you want, which other mediums, I mean, it's difficult to do that with with video, when you're doing like a regular what do you call it, reportage we say here, but like a little segment about something or a little report about something. There isn't that freedom. You're just kind of stuck a little bit in the reality of it, where every story has an emotional layer, has subjective elements to it that, it's more realistic to bring out those elements too, pretending like you're completely objective because it's a camera and because we kind of believe that a camera is objective. It's kind of a false belief, but just kind of we have that instinct towards it. I feel like comics can be more truthful about the fact that, well, look, nothing's really objective. This is all just somebody's perspective on whatever it is that we're talking about. And so I think that's the power of the comics journalism.
So you talked about Joe Sacco, also Akira, and other major inspirations and influences. Are there more that you can specifically point to? Are there specific graphic journalists or comics artists whose work kind of inspires your own, or are there bodies of work that you're responding to in your own?
There's many artists that have influenced me a lot. In comics journalism, I don't really read a lot other than people that I kind of know. Feels like like Andy Warner's work is hugely influential for me in that field, and the artists of the Nib, I like, it's become kind of like a family. So I enjoy these people's works, but I mentioned Scott McCloud. He's been a huge influence, but those are the standard main ones, Scott McCloud and Joe Sacco. But yeah, fortunately it's true, they're amazing. One of my favorite all-time comic book artists is Paul Pope. I like the way he uses science fiction to tell very human, very internal stories almost. His work has been hugely an influence on me. And I love a lot of the, other than Akira, other than Katsuhiro Otomo, like really the most amount of comics that I read comes from Japan. Jiro Taniguchi is really good. My favorite thing, though, of all time is called One Piece. It's not just my favorite comic or my favorite cartoon. It's my favorite creation, human creation, is One Piece by Ichiro Oda. It's this kind of pirate manga. Yeah, I mean, also, like I'm saying, a lot of my friends and colleagues are very good influences for me. in their fields and also in the field of comics and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of in general. That's off the top of my head, the things that I can think of. Something else? No, yeah, I think that's it.
Now, you have sort of touched upon this already in the answers so far, in our discussion so far, on some of the aspects of the goals that you imagine for comics journalism, the kind of work that you do. But what are some of the specific goals that you think about for each of your projects when you are researching, when you're working, when you're kind of in the middle of it, and imagine for those specific projects?
Goals as like, you mean as in like what the work will do after it's done?
Yeah, and also the kind of people that kind of audience that it wants to talk with or talk to, or the kind of issues that it wants to highlight. Also, just in terms of the life of your work after you have let it go into the world.
This might be maybe a bit of a childish answer, but I try my best not to think about the goals when I'm actually doing a thing. I try to let the goal be the thing that the work is trying to become itself, like not who might read it. Of course, I'm not saying I'm a master at this. My mind tends to wander, to be like, people are gonna really like this, or I wonder if this person's gonna like that, or whatever. And I try to quiet that out. Be like, no. Then when you think about these, it drives the work away from its true self and towards towards the just superficially pleasing others, instead of, if the work is the best thing that it itself can be, then it'll provide its own goal to the people who read it. In a way, it won't be my goal, it would be the goal of this thing that I've created somewhere. Am I being too abstract about this? I mean, I'm trying to verbalize. I never really thought to before. But yeah, that's basically the idea. I know where it's going to go, where the idea comes from, but yeah, I know where it's going to go, as in like where it might be disseminated at the end, where it's going to be published, where it's going to be printed, or whatever. But I try to not let that influence the middle of the work, which is before I get the project and after I'm done with the project. Like that whole middle, I try my best to just let the work itself come out.
I think that's a great answer. To risk pushing a similar question forward, how do you imagine the future of comics, either as an art form or as a platform for telling journalism? What are your either hopes or the ways that you see the field going in the future?
Again, I'm going to go with, I try not to think about that because it's always surprising. It's always like, it's going to go in places that I've never thought of and that I've never imagined. So I do my best to just kind of give myself to the flow instead of trying to predict and move. I guess trying to think back to the beginning of Samandal, it has been so long ago, but I'm sure I had a much more specific, naive 25-year-old goal to like, just be like, I want to change the world in this way, and comics have to look like that or something like this. But I feel like I've forgotten who that kid was. And now I'm just kind of, the world changes no matter what plans you have for it, it's been showing us quite often these days that doesn't really care about our plans. So or our plans for it, you know, let's say, for like it's just gonna do itself. So the best thing to do is just kind of try to find your way in this storm. Try to ride it out.
I like it. It's very Zen comics. That's maybe your answer. It's like a new Zen comic.
It's been the mode that I've been in the past like few months. You've caught me at a very like, you know, everything is really just literally falling apart around us here. There's like no electricity, there's no gasoline for cars, there's food is disappearing, there's just really nothing. It's like super hot because it's the middle of the summer as well, and the dollars, the exchange rate is like, you know, it was 1,500 2 years ago. Now it's like around 20,000 mark. So I don't know how much that's like 1,500% change or something in the past year, couple of years. So I finally reached a place where I'm like, okay, I mean, if that's what the world's going to offer, I'm still going to find a good slice myself, like a nice boat to sit in that can, you know, jostle me on those crazy waves. Just build a boat, have a few people that you care about on that boat, and just try to navigate as best you can.
And then that brings us to the idea about so many comics journalists, artists entering this field. What would be your advice for an aspiring comics journalist? Are there, or even a comics artist, are there specific trends that you are, or kind of movements in this field that you are looking at and getting excited about, or not so excited about?
Advice for youngsters getting into comics is, I don't know, it's, I don't find that actually I can give anybody advice about this. Like, I don't find that I mean, I don't do, because I do a bunch of other things as well. Like, it's difficult for me to think of myself as like a comic book artist, you know, as my main thing, because I just go in and out of it. Sometimes for 3-4 years, I don't do any comics, then come back to it. Like I have painting, I have music, I work, my friends do movies, so I'm usually helping them, and so I'm always shifting through things. So I'm not really somebody who follows a specific school in any of the fields, or it's just kind of, a lot of people say that's the downfall of my work, because like even in paintings I have like 15 styles, in comics I have like 6-7 things, the different things that I do. It's hard to look at the work and be like, oh, that's I think that's done by Omar, or so yeah, it's hard for me to advise anybody on their life. Everybody's life is just so specific. I mean, the one advice that I can give that is kind of a bit tired and a little bit cheesy, and it's just like, you know, just do whatever it is you believe in until it becomes good. Don't change it because somebody tells you you're not, it's, you know, it's not as important, or it's not as good as you can be, or be like, and like shift from your things. If you want to do 15 things and, you know, just be relatively unknown for the rest of your life, do that if it gives you happiness, you know. And if you just want to spend all your time making comics that people don't want to see, do that, you know. And because when it becomes the comic that you want to see, then people will see it. And whether it's one person or 1,000 or 1,000,000 people see your things, it's still been, you know, it's still been made, and it still has the same worth, because it's become a thing in the world, you know, and everything has, you know, equal value because of its existence.
I think that's a beautiful piece of advice and a wonderful way to conclude. So thank you again. This has been an exhibition talk for The Art of the News. I'm Professor Kate Kelp-Stebbins. I was joined today by my co-host Dave Sanyo and the incredible and profound artist Omar Khouri. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.